Okay, so this is Chapter 1 lecture. This is the very first one in the book. The title is New World Beginnings, and the entire lecture series is going to be keyed to the 15th edition of the American pageant. So here's how it starts. You can look there on the screen, and it shows what scientists call Pangea, and that's according to plate tectonics. All the continents were once attached to each other. You can see that green there on the far left is what later becomes the United States. What later becomes the Caribbean was linked up with Brazil. The East Coast was primarily linked up with Africa. This happened hundreds of millions of years ago, and slowly over the eons, the Atlantic Ocean was created, the Pacific Ocean was shortened. And once this land broke up, Pangea didn't exist anymore, and the plants and animals became isolated from one another. This has pretty big consequences because once the Americas are eventually found, there's a lot of exchange of new plants, animals that hadn't seen each other at all, and it has dire consequences for the Indians. This here is a timeline of all of recorded history. So you can see that they primarily in Sumeria, Babylon, Egypt, they start to actually record history, have written things in 4000 BC. So this would have been approximately 6,000 years ago. You can see for the vast majority of this time, it's way before the birth of Jesus, and you can see there in 1607 when Virginia is actually founded. So the New World itself, and America in particular, is a very, very recent development. Even more so, even within the finding of America, to the point where America becomes its own country, you can see that for half of the time, there from 1492 all the way to 1776, it's pretty much half the time on this timeline, where we weren't even a country. So it's really from the middle of this timeline to the present that we've actually been our own country. Okay, so how do people get here? The people of the Americas. There was an ice age that started a few million years ago, and as the scientists theorize that this lowered the sea level. And for whatever reason, there wasn't ice in between Siberia and Alaska. But the lowering of the sea level in this fairly shallow space, you can see right where that red arrow is the current coast of America and Russia. And that's the Bering Strait there. It's very narrow. If you watch the fishing shows on the Discovery Channel, the ships tend to go there because they can actually get to the bottom because it's a fairly shallow area. So scientists theorize that this area was actually a land bridge called Beringia. And that starting about 35,000 years ago, people started to migrate from Siberia to what later becomes Alaska, following herds of animals. Or perhaps they weren't maybe walking on this land bridge, but it may have been a little dotted with islands, and they were actually using boats, and they were following, fishing and stuff like that. Approximately 10,000 years ago, the ice caps melted, and what this meant then is that the sea level rose, and there was no more land bridge, and so the migration from Siberia to Alaska stopped. And so for approximately the last 10,000 years then, whoever was in America, they were here to stay. They weren't getting new influx of migrations. And you can see this is just a map from your book. It shows you over time the different migrations and how they got there and when they got there and all that good stuff. 1546. This is a map of the New World. It shows this after the discovery, but primarily Spanish, but also some Portuguese and some English explorers. The first 50 years or so after discovery was basically spent trying to figure out what this new world was. For the early point, remember, they thought it was actually Asia that they had found. Then they spent once they discovered that it wasn't Asia, they spent most of their time trying to figure out a way to get to Asia. And so they're just hugging the coasts and mapping it and whatnot. You can see up here, this is, I would guess, would be Greenland. You can see here's Florida down here. There's Cuba, and then South America on the way. All right, so who was living in the Americas before the Europeans arrived? The AP test doesn't make you memorize there's approximately 2,000 Indian groups, but they do want you to know the big ones. And here are the big ones, especially the Aztecs. You get tested on the Aztecs almost every single year. They're in modern-day Mexico. The Inca, they're in modern-day Peru. The Mississippian, they're along in the Midwest, especially in Illinois. We're going to talk about Cahokia later and the mound builders. The Anasazi, they're in the Southwest along the Rio Grande. They're most tested for, they mysteriously disappeared. They created these cities on the side of cliffs, and then all of a sudden they disappeared. Scientists think it's because they basically wrecked their own environment through irrigation projects and not destroying the land as far as taking the nutrients out of the ground and stuff like that, over-farming. The Mayan, which are in Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula. The Iroquois, which are in the northeast of the United States. And the Pueblo cultures of the southwest United States. Probably the biggest thing that the Indians in the New World discovered, created, cultivated is corn. As far as the book and the AP test, they basically use the terms maize and corn interchangeably. And so you got to know that. And you can see here that corn was central to transition from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle in the New World to one of civilizations. And once you could grow a big field of corn, then you didn't have to spend your entire day looking for berries or hunting. You could actually do other stuff. You could also have enough food to support larger families. When everybody's more fed, then they don't die from starvation, malnutrition. So you're able to sustain bigger families. And so populations tend to boom once they discover settled agriculture, especially with corn. Another thing that they want you to know is something called three-sister farming. It's a way, it's kind of a hippie way of growing corn, where you actually have beans that grow on the corn stalks and squash that covers the ground area. So you can actually, in the same piece of ground that you would normally just grow corn, you can actually grow corn, beans, and squash. Of course, you can eat all three, and all three of them kind of help each other grow and all this other stuff. This just shows you the map, shows you where all the different Indian groups lived, and they're broken up, somewhat into geographic regions there in the northeast. You see the Shawnee, here's most of the Iroquois up here in what later becomes the New York, Pennsylvania area. You can see the Pueblos are going to be down here in the southwest, along with the Apache. The Anasazi be down here somewhere. And then down here you can see the Aztec. Those are the big ones. Here's one you want to notice here. The Taino Indians. These are the Indians that actually Columbus first comes into contact with. Columbus actually landed first at the Bahamas over here. And then the other Indian group you want to take note of are the Powhatan Indians. These were the Indians that the English came across when they founded Jamestown. Alright, Cahokia. This is a very big Indian settlement in actually central Illinois. You can see they had the big mounds that are in a pyramidal structure, and it was estimated this to be one of the biggest cities in the world at this time before the Europeans came and colonized the New World. Alright, who the indirect discoverers of the New World? Well, there was a direct discoverer, and that was actually the Vikings. Leif Erikson, it's theorized, actually founded a Viking colony in what later becomes Canada, in Newfoundland, in about 1000 AD. The place is called La Sens, I'm going to butcher this, La Sens Aus Meadows, but it never really had the support of anybody else in Scandinavia, and so the colony kind of falters, and it just becomes kind of a Norse myth after a time. But the key indirect discoverer of the New World are actually the Crusades. The Crusades, you had the nobility and actually commoners from Europe went to the Holy Land, and they conquered it, from approximately 1000 to 1300, maybe 1400 or so AD. There's lots of little wars, and they lose territory and they gain territory and whatnot. But you have this approximately 300 to 400 years of direct contact with the Middle East. And what these Europeans are doing is they're exchanging goods, Asian goods, goods that they can't get in Europe. This includes perfume, silk, spices, and especially sugar. Sugar becomes a good preservative and obviously an additive to fruit. Once the Christians are kicked out of the Middle East for good, then they can't obtain these goods without absolutely exorbitant costs from Middle Eastern middlemen, and they can't go around Africa yet. They can't really go through a land route, and obviously the Christians and the Arabs are not on good terms during this time period, so they needed a new way to get this sugar. During this time, you also have the Reconquista in Spain, where the Spanish are kicking the Moors, the Islamic Moors, out of Spain, and Ferdinand and Isabella unite the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, and basically you get a united Spain. Once this country actually kicks out the Muslims for good, they become probably the most powerful Christian European country on earth at the time. They have a very powerful military and a very powerful navy, and they want to use it. And so they're trying to flex their muscle. Trade routes. So here are the trade routes right around the time that Columbus actually sails west. And you can see here that the Portuguese are starting to go, and we're going to talk about in a minute, they're starting to go south around Africa due to some technological developments. And then you get the infamous Silk Road. But again, this whole time, if you're a European, you can't just go through the Middle East. Right? You're going to get either killed or enslaved. Right? So you have to then just purchase stuff from Middle Eastern middlemen, and so that becomes incredibly expensive. So the first step was actually Africa, and it's primarily the Portuguese. The Portuguese, along with some other countries, but the Portuguese really perfected it, developed a type of boat called the caravel, and it's got a bunch of smaller sails, all shaped at different angles, and it's impressive in that you can essentially sail into the wind. The wind blows into one of the sails, and then the wind gets redirected amongst all the other sails, and actually you're able to go into the wind. So you're able to sail south along the African coast, despite the fact that the wind predominantly is blowing towards the north from that spot. And then once you get to a certain degree south, if you want to return home, then you can use that wind, but you can also then sail out into the out west into the Atlantic. And once you get wide enough into the Atlantic, then both sea currents and wind patterns will take you right back to Portugal. And what do they want in Africa? Well, one of the big things they want in Africa are slaves. The slavery between Africa and Europe, it had been happening for well over 1,000 years, even before the discovery of America. And primarily how it operated is that Africans would enslave another tribe of Africans, usually in the interior, through warfare, through debt, or through just greed, and take them to the coast, and then a European slave ship would come along and basically trade with the African middlemen to get the slaves from them, and then send them on their way to destinations all over the world. A very, very famous spot along the coast was just off the coast of Senegal, and it's Gorée Island. It was the slave fortress here, and so this was basically, like a holding cell, holding pattern of it. There's a better picture on the next slide. Here's the entire island off the coast of Senegal, and here you can see with the green roof is the slave fortress. All right, Columbus. Everybody's talked about Columbus ever since kindergarten. You know all the details all that you need anyway. You know, even though he sailed for Spain, he was actually a Genoan, which is an Italian. But the stuff that you need to know is that in October of 1492, he actually lands his 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, land in the Bahamas. He thinks that he has discovered, I can't remember if it's the Philippines or Japan or Indonesia. He thinks he's in Asia. And so he names the Native Americans there, who were known as the Taino, he names them as the Indians. And the name just sticks, and for the rest of time, Native Americans are known as Indians, despite the fact that it's not Asia. Alright, the Columbian Exchange. We talked a little bit about this. Remember, because of the breakup of Pangaea, you had these continents, especially between the New World and the Old World, that were separated for hundreds of millions of years. And so once Columbus and later explorers come to the New World, they're bringing Old World stuff with them, and they're getting New World stuff. And for the most part, the Old World, so I'm talking about Europe, Asia, and Africa, they made out big time with this Columbian Exchange, and the New World lost out. All right. Now, obviously, the Old World was primarily looking for precious metals, gold and silver, and other stuff that they could make a profit off of. Corn, potatoes, pineapples, tomatoes, tobacco, beans, vanilla, chocolate, all of those things originate in the New World. And just think about that. It's tough to envision, for instance, Ireland without the potato. The potato has such an important agricultural significance to that country and its food, and then later on in the mid-1800s with the potato famine that causes a wide number of Irish people to both starve to death and to migrate from Ireland to lots of places, including the United States. But that's all because of the potato. If you're of Italian descent, it's tough to think of Italian food without the tomato. Right? And then, of course, syphilis. So there was a lot of stuff going on in the TP between the Conquistadores and some Native American women, apparently. What's the Old World bringing to the New World? Wheat, sugar, rice, coffee. Probably the biggest thing would be horses. You've seen lots of cowboy and Indian movies. It's tough to think of the Great Plains Indians without the horse. But prior to the exploration of the New World, there were no horses in the Americas. Probably the most unfortunate thing that the Old World brings to the New World are diseases. You can see there smallpox, measles, the bubonic plague, a bunch of others. The most important one is smallpox. Smallpox absolutely wipes out a huge number, millions and millions actually, of Native Americans. Right? And then another one of the most unfortunate things would be slave labor. And it has demographic consequences for essentially every country in the New World. So you have here American foods aided population boom. We talked about the potato and corn and all that. Right around the same time, you can see within a generation, the populations of Europe and Africa explode. And they do so because of these new agricultural products that they're able to grow in Europe and Africa. As I said before, the Great Plains Indians quickly adopt the horse, and it becomes central to their way of life. And this last point is very, very controversial, but it's estimated that approximately 90% of Native Americans died within 100 years of discovery. So basically by the end of the 1500s, almost all of them because of disease. There were several that died, obviously, from warfare and torture and stuff like that, but almost all of them died of disease, and almost all of them died because of the disease of smallpox. In fact, the huge number of Native Americans died without ever seeing or probably even hearing about Europeans, because the smallpox would just wipe out almost whole villages and then spread, inland faster than any of the explorers and conquistadors could spread. Alright, speaking of conquistadors, here are two vocab terms that you see all the time on the AP test, so we're going to talk about them now. The Treaty of Tordesillas, probably pronouncing that wrong, doesn't really matter. It was formed in 1494, and it was basically because Portugal and Spain were coming to blows over the New World. They both wanted to claim all of it for themselves. And if you look at a map, Portugal and Spain are right next to each other in the Old World. And there was a lot of intermarriage, and part of the Reconquista, they fought with each other and against each other and all this other stuff. So the Pope stepped in and basically forced them to sign this treaty between both of them, where they basically split up the New World. Spain gets almost everything. Portugal gets Brazil, but Portugal got most of Africa. So that's how it was split up. The other vocab term is the encomienda system. And this was a system that kind of got the Pope's stamp of approval, whereby a conquistador would essentially get an entire Indian village that he got to own, and promise that he would bring in priests and he would build a church and he would Christianize them, right? Save their souls. This was essentially slavery, without using the term slavery. And being forced to be Christianized and having hard labor in the process, it didn't really sit well with many of the Indians. You can see here are some of the exploration routes from the Old World. You can see where there are areas of influence and colonization were. You can see here the Portuguese, even after discovery of the New World, were primarily concerned with Africa, because they had already been dominating Africa for the previous 50 to 100 years. And so that Treaty of Tordesillas, it basically draws a line right here in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and it says everything east of that line is Portugal's, everything west of that line is Spain's. So that's why, because Brazil ekes past that eastern line, why Portugal gets Brazil, and why basically everything else belongs to Spain. Obviously, at the very, very north end here, you see both English and French claims. Alright, early Spanish explorations. There's a story you probably heard of Ponce de Leon looking for, was it the Fountain of Youth or El Dorado? I can't remember which one. It doesn't really matter. He basically discovers and it hangs around Florida. Then you got De Soto, who goes in the interior. He's supposedly the first European to cross the Mississippi. Probably the biggest ones are going to be Cortez, who ends up conquering the Aztecs here in Mexico in the early 1500s, and Coronado, who basically goes up discovers the Pacific Ocean, and up north, I should say, and then goes on to find the Rockies and the Colorado River, and I think he finds the Grand Canyon, stuff like that. Alright, the Conquest of Mexico. There's the two main guys here that you have to know are Hernando Cortez, who is the Spanish conquistador, and Montezuma, who is the Aztec king. This story is it's kind of funny in that the Aztecs, central to their religion was human sacrifice, lots of it, and they're the dominant tribe of Indians in this area of the world, really. And so the other Indian tribes that neighbored them didn't like them, including the Mayans. The Mayans are primarily in the Yucatan Peninsula. The Aztecs are primarily in mainland Mexico in the central highlands there. So once Cortez shows up and he hears about the Aztecs, and they do some search and they find out more information about them, of course he wants to conquer them, wants to take all their good stuff. And he's able to enlist lots and lots of Mayan allies, because they basically are sick of getting their butts kicked by the Aztecs and having their hearts cut out and stuff like that. So that's really, Cortez is given a lot of credit for defeating this gigantic, super militaristic superpower. But in reality, it was Mayans, along with European technology, that actually, at the end of the day, was able to do it. One of the things that you're every once in a while tested on is this term called Noche Triste, which is the translation of sad night. And so because the Spanish had come, they had surrounded the Aztecs. Montezuma originally had treated Cortez as like a returning god from some ancient Aztec prophecy, but he realized right away that it was BS. And so they basically start fighting right away. So the Spanish start to siege the capital of the Aztecs, Tenochtitlan, which is on an island, and there's a bunch of causeways, or little, I guess you could call them little land bridges, basically, to get to this island. And they're laying siege. Well, on June 30th, 1520, the Aztecs attacked, right, and they drove the Spanish from the causeways, and they killed a lot of Spanish, and the Spanish were forced to retreat, and all this other stuff. Eventually, the Spanish built a bunch of boats, and they're going around this lake, and they're just, lobbing shells into the city for a long time, and they cut off the water supply. And so just like any other siege, eventually the Aztecs who are living in the city, they start to starve to death and get, they can't access fresh water, and so they're getting diseases and whatnot. And so approximately a year later, August 13th, 1521, the city falls. Of course, then the Spanish have essentially conquered the major superpowers in the New World at this point. One of the things that the Spanish do is that they're almost all Spanish men. And so they all take, essentially, Native American women and as their wives. Now, I don't think, probably the vast majority of cases were the Native American women asked about this or, go willingly. So they're essentially taking as sex slaves. And the offspring are known as the mestizos. And so they're people of mixed Indian and European heritage. Alright, here's a picture of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. You can see there the main city in the middle of this gigantic lake with the causeways going to and from it. So the Spanish conquistadors and their priests, remember the encomienda system, spread mainly north from Mexico into California. Along the coast there, they found a number of Spanish missions, and into New Mexico, and eventually even Texas. That's who eventually builds the Alamo. The big thing that you have to remember from this point, that you're testing every once in a great while, is Pope's Rebellion, 1680. Way ahead of us right now. But this is now a good 100 to 150 years of Spanish rule in this area in basically the southwest United States, the New Mexico, Arizona region, where they have been repressing. They've been trying to Christianize these Indians and tell them that they can't do this ghost dance and smoke these different things in their little huts and whatnot. Basically, these pagan rituals. And eventually, the Pueblo Indians, they rebelled. They were sick and tired of being treated like this, and so they kill hundreds of Spanish. The book says scores of priests, and destroy every Catholic church in the province. So the rebellion, just like every other rebellion that we pretty much talk about during this course, is put down ruthlessly, and that's that. Here you can see the spread. Here are the Spanish missions I talked about on the coast of California. Up here you get the Santa Fe area. Here's El Paso. So you can see it's the New Mexico, Texas region of what later becomes the United States. Alright, the chronology. This is pretty much it. So you can see here, this is kind of a recap. So approximately 30,000 years ago or so, the first humans cross Beringia, the land bridge from Siberia to America. About 7,000 years ago or so, corn is developed as a staple crop and spreads. You have the height of the Mississippian settlement of Cahokia, which I talked about, right around 1100 AD. You have the Crusades going on. 1680, Pope's Rebellion.